War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Orlov Valley. His father lay in state in the farm of the family home. Tomorrow, he would be buried on the top of the hill that bordered their land just to the northeast. Ivan Grigory Orlov sat with his son Alexei in silence. The moment called for that. An hour earlier, the room had been occupied by mourners from the nearby villages, 25 at a time, paying their respects to the late Baron. The air was still heavy with the scent of candles and the murmurs of prayer. The valley that stretched out beyond their home had been named after the Orlov family well over 100 years ago. It was a vast expanse, dotted with many villages, each one owing some part of its existence to the legacy of the Orlovs. Today, Ivan said goodbye to the man who had changed their legacy, for the worse. 54 years had passed since the man who lay casketed before him had defied the Tsar's order to emancipate his serfs. His refusal, which might have otherwise slipped through the cracks due to the valley's remoteness from the palaces of St. Petersburg, had somehow reached the ear of the Tsar. The Tsar's retribution had been swift and humiliating. Tsar Alexander II had ordered the entire valley to be divided, stripping control from the Orlovs. The keeping of the name Orlov Valley served as a reminder of the repercussions of defying a Tsar. He had been told this story many times through his adolescence by his father, as they used to sit atop the hill overlooking the lands that used to be theirs quite often. He glanced at his son Alexei, now 22 years old. He had also been told the story, just not by Ivan himself. It had always been told through Sergei's lens. Alexei, son, let's go for a walk. What was left of their land was situated at the southwesternmost corner of the valley, the border of that land accentuated by a hill from which they could look upon the valley and see all of what was once theirs. Ivan walked with his son around the land's boundary, and as always, ended up at the top of the hill. As he looked out on the vast expanse of land, he reminded himself of something his father had once said. He found himself speaking out loud to Alexei. He left us this as a message. What was that, father? Asked Alexei, a confused look on his face. Your grandfather had always been under the impression that Tsar Alexander left him this parcel as a message. What do you mean, father? The family estate used to be about a mile and a half in that direction. He pointed towards the northeast, to the spot in which he knew the Luka River cut through the land. That's where the Volkovs live now. This manor that we live in now was once just a second home. I know all of this already, father, Alexei responded. Grandfather lived too long in the past, and he kept you there with him. Ivan glared disappointingly at his son. Be careful what you say, son. No, father. I've done that too often. We need to look to the future. We need to bring more peasants to our village. We cannot keep dwelling on what once was. We need to grow what currently is. He knew Alexei was right, but there was no way he was going to have this conversation now, not with his father still laying in state within the manor. Yet his mouth had a different idea. That should be easy. Look how many peasants from all over the valley came today to pay their respects. Not many men in this life could have that many families of his former serfs love him as much as they did him. He heard Alexei scoff. Don't be naive, father. They came because the barons forced them to. They're still peasants after all. He knew this was most likely true. Well, they still came, and that says something to me, doesn't it to you? It does, but what you see as families of former serfs paying their respects, I see is an entire valley celebrating the fact that he's gone. This too caught Ivan off guard, but Alexei continued. For them, it closes a chapter 50 years in the making. If they think that way, then how can we attract more peasants to our village? More men to sow the fields, more women to make the garments. How, Alexei? He felt Alexei put his arm around his shoulder. His tone softened. We just need to treat our villages better than grandfather did. We do that, and the word will spread. Interesting thought, son. Ivan produced a kerchief and wiped his brow. He looked up at the mid-June sun. Let's head back. The guests had arrived at 7 p.m., and as it approached 8:30, dinner was now being served. This was the first dinner party undertaken since Ivan had become the baron of the neighboring village of Orlovka, and every landowner of note had accepted his invitation. The Volkovs, the Mikhailovs, the Chernovs, the Sidorovs, and even Pavel Andreevich from the far eastern ridge had come, their carriages filling the circular drive outside the manor in a way Ivan had not seen since he was a boy. The dining hall glowed with candlelight. Silverware, polished for the occasion, gleamed beneath the chandeliers, and the long oak table, scarred from generations of Orlov hands, had been laid with its best linens. Servants moved carefully between the chairs, pouring wine and placing courses with practiced ease. It had only been 2.5 weeks since Sergei's funeral, yet the valley moved forward quickly, as if eager to turn the page, and tonight, for the first time since taking on the title, Ivan was expected to host, not as a grieving son, but as a baron in full. Conversations rose and fell around him, polite, cordial, no animosity, no mention of the past and how the Orlovs' former land had been gifted to these families. Ivan sat at the head of the table and glanced around the room. He caught a glance of his wife Elena, who was talking quietly to Mikhail Volkov and his wife Natalia. Across from them listened Baron and Baroness Sakharov. Ivan noticed that Alexei was pretending to not listen to the conversation. This made him smile on the inside. The table was rather large, and around it sat the other attending barons, who all engaged in polite conversation. This was going very well, he thought to himself. None of the men at this table were the original recipients of Orlov land. Those men and their sons had died long before Ivan's father Sergei. These were their grandsons, young and polite, men who had inherited titles only in recent years. Not one of them was older than 32. From the other end of the table sat Baron Andreevich, who tapped his glass calling for silence, and as was a custom, the room obliged. He stood. I wish to thank Baron Ivan Orlov for the invitation we received this evening. He raised his glass and waited as the rest of the table echoed the sentiment by chanting, "Hear, hear," and tapping their glasses with their silver. He continued, For too many years, this valley has felt the tension coming from this manor, and this gesture, this dinner, leads me to believe that we're entering a new age, an age where we can get past the actions of a czar against a patriarch that transpired well before most of us were even born. Ivan watched him raise his glass, and in response, Ivan stood and raised his. He noticed the entirety of the table looking at him. They expect a response, he thought to himself. How do I respond to that? To a man casually bringing up my father's death at a formal dinner? This was unheard of in polite society. He realized that he was not upset about it, however, and that the conversations would have to happen eventually. He may as well clear the air now. My father, the last of a generation, has gone to meet his maker. I've invited you all here tonight to tell you all one thing. His animosity towards you, towards your grandfathers, your fathers, and your families, died with him. A man cleared his throat near the doorway of the dining room. Ivan looked his way. It was Fyodor Peskov, a man who often delivered important messages in the valley. "Please, Fyodor, come in." Fyodor Peskov was an older gentleman, around 55. He had lived to see the shift of importance from family to family in this valley. The fact that he was here in Orlov Manor to deliver a message meant that Ivan had regained a sense of importance with the death of his father. Peskov walked in and made his way towards the table. Ivan reached his hand out to retrieve the letter, but to his surprise, Fyodor stopped at Baron Volkov. "Sir, it's important you read this." Volkov took the letter and glanced around the room before dismissing the messenger. Ivan had stood motionless. He had gravely misread the situation. He lowered his hand and sat. He felt Elena take his other hand. She had noticed. He watched as Volkov opened the letter. The room was silent now. News rarely came to anyone this late in the evening. Impatient, Ivan forced a chuckle as Volkov unfolded the letter and began to read, and said, "Well, what is it, Volkov?" The silence in the dining room was eerie as everyone seemed to be awaiting the same thing. Finally, he folded the letter and handed it to Ivan, keeping the envelope. Ivan unfolded the letter, cleared his throat. He intended to read it aloud to the gathering, but as his eyes scanned the word, he was unable to speak. His throat became dry. He quickly looked at Volkov and watched him just nod his head in assent. It was Alexei who spoke next, his impetuousness and youth breaking through the calm demeanor he had been displaying throughout the evening. "Well, what is it?" he asked. Ivan looked again at Volkov, the young man, all of 27 years old, the grandson of the man who took over the family's main home, the manor by the river, the largest manor in the valley 54 years prior. "We are in your home, Orlov. Please do the honor of telling the room what it is we've just learned." Ivan stood again. He took a drink of water to wet his throat, dropped the letter on the table, and let his eyes survey the room. Everyone was waiting on him now. He began. 5 days ago, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian national, Volkov added. The room again fell silent for a moment, until Alexei put his youthful naivete on display. "And this affects us how?" Alexei asked. It was another baron who answered, Baron Mikhailov. "It's not the man himself that is important, but where it happened and who did it." "What does that mean?" Alexei asked. Ivan looked directly at his son and spoke. "We are an ally of Serbia, Alexei. If Austria-Hungary decides to respond, then we're obligated to protect them." "And that means?" Alexei asked. Volkov stood as if he was preparing to leave. "It means war." Volkov had been correct. Russia had begun to mobilize a month later, after Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. Within 3 days, Russia had gone from partial mobilization to full mobilization, culminating in Germany, an ally of Austria-Hungary, declaring war against them. Ivan and other barons in the valley had no choice but to compile lists of men for the military and then sit idly by over the past year as many villagers were called off to war. First, it was the reservists and men who had already served, but soon the conscription began to take any able-bodied peasants. Ivan sat alone on the hill overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, he could watch the darkness settle over the valley as the sun set to the west. His mind raced. Men were being conscripted all over the country. News reports told of men being slaughtered en masse at the front, which had been located on the Russia-German border. He was unsure if the local Zemstvo would even see him. He was even more unsure if the man would receive his gift or his recommendations. Tomorrow was a pivotal day, and Ivan knew it. The plan had formed in his head a week ago, and in the days since, he visited every baron in the valley. His social calls, however, were merely a vessel for his hidden agenda, to compile as much information as he could about these men. Tomorrow, he would try to put this information to use. Long after the sun set, he made his way back to the manor and into bed next to Elena. The man sat across from him examining the contents of the envelope. His nameplate on his desk read Nikolai Azramyov Loganov, Semstro officer. Ivan knew that this was the man that the Tsarist government assigned to verify the information of people eligible for conscription. He also reviewed exceptions that were often given to men of social standing, including barons. "I am perplexed, Mr. Orlov," Loganov started. "You've given me 9 names here. 9 men with no children over the age of 10. All landowners inherited land from their fathers." "Men who are fit to serve, sir. What's perplexing about that?" Ivan added. "It's perplexing to me why you would bring me these names in the first place." "Sir, 224 men have been conscripted from villages throughout the Orlov Valley. Men whose names were submitted to you by myself and the other 9 landowners in the valley. The men in that file there," Ivan explained. Loganov still wore a confused expression when he asked, "I'm not sure that explains anything to me, Mr. Orlov. Why is this file in my hands now?" Ivan clasped his hands together and laid them on the desk before the Zemstro officer. "Sorry, sir. Allow me to explain further. If you were to review the lists of men given to you by myself and the other 9 landowners, you would notice that on my list I also submitted my name and the name of my son." "Which is how it should be done, Mr. Orlov." "Correct. I was the man trusted to bring the list of men to this office last year. I was able to go over them when I received them. None of the other landowners had put their names on the list. They had. He knew this, but he had spent 2 days replicating the lists and removing their names. It had been a painstaking task that he had to hide from Elena and Alexei, but he had done it. Loganov cocked an eyebrow. He was paying attention now. "So you are telling me that all 9 of these men decided that they were too good to call into service for the Tsar?" Ivan put his hands up in the air in a gesture that said, "Your guess is as good as mine." "Well then, I must thank you for this insight, Mr. Orlov. I shall review the lists that were submitted, and if in fact these names were left off of them, I shall take care of it." Ivan stood and prepared to leave and reached for Loganov's outstretched hand. "The pleasure is all mine, sir." Once back outside, he took a deep breath of the late summer air. This part of his plan had worked. Now he had to hope that the rest would fall in place as well. He sat in his office reviewing tax information from the nearby village. He needed to figure out how much was for him and how much he would send the Tsarish government. It was quiet as it usually was as he worked. The midwinter sun hung in the air outside of his window, obscured by clouds and the snowflakes that fell gently from the sky. It had been 3 months since he visited the Semstro office and given Loganov the information. Since then, 3 of the young men had been conscripted. It started with Pavel Andreevich, who had received the news a mere 2 weeks later. Mikhail Volkov had been next, and then Ivan Chernov. Just as he had expected, each man had come to him and asked him to be the trustee of their estate in their absence, to look after it, to look after the villagers and collect the taxes. Their sons were too young, and their wives could never be trustees or even landowners, especially in a time of war. His task was almost complete when Elena burst into the room. He looked up to see her face welled up with tears and the letter in her hand. "They've conscripted him. They've conscripted Alexei." He had expected this. He knew that Loganov would go over each and every list, and that every able-bodied man was to be reviewed for conscription. He had also expressed this possibility to Elena and Alexei. Apparently, they had not taken him seriously. He stood and went to her, taking her into his arms as she cried. He watched as Alexei stood on the platform waiting for the train that would take him to the front. The snow fell harder today. It seemed almost symbolic. The night before, Ivan had been visited 6 times by 6 other landowners in the valley. They had been conscripted as well. Each conversation was the same. The young man explaining to Ivan the circumstances, then standing hat in hand as they asked him to become a trustee in their absence. Each time, Ivan accepted. Each time, he had to hide his jubilation behind sad eyes and a frown. Elena had not come to see her son off. She could not bear it. In fact, she had not been seen outside of her rooms over the last month since they received the notice. Ivan watched as a plume of smoke arose on the horizon, and the unmistakable sound of iron on track rattled in the air. The train was coming. His son was leaving. His son may never return. 15 minutes later, the procession started. Men, now soldiers, piling onto the train cars. The social hierarchy cast aside. They were all equal now. Landowners, sons of landowners, and villagers, all now just soldiers. Ivan stood near the platform, his hands clasped behind his back. He watched as the train started to pull away. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. The valley was his. For now. He watched from the hill as villagers from all over the valley ascended towards his manor. He knew that there would be trouble one day. Once the Tsar abdicated the throne back in March, his tenure had become tenuous at best. The October air smelled different in 1917. Ivan could not put his finger on what it was, but it was something. Things had gone horribly wrong for the Russian military since the war had started, and throwing men at the problem had not been the solution the Tsar had hoped. Death notices had come every week throughout the valley, and among the dead were 9 young landowners. This would have been the ideal situation for Ivan had the Tsar not abdicated. He would have easily wrestled control from each family in the valley and thus regained the entire Orlov Valley for his family, the way it ought to be. He had not heard from Alexei since the day the train took him away. If Elena had received letters from him, Ivan was unaware. Elena had ceased speaking to him since the day last spring when his plan had come to light. He had received a letter from Loganov at the Zemstvo office thanking him for taking the initiative and bringing the misinformation to light. Elena had read the letter first, as she often had. She blamed him now for the Zemstvo office reviewing the list again and conscripting Alexei. An event that Ivan had seen as a minor sacrifice in his effort to reclaim his ancestral land had been seen as a major betrayal to his wife. From the top of the hill, as the villagers approached, he slowly turned and walked back to the manor house. He knocked lightly on Elena's door and heard, "What do you want?" from within. "We need to talk, Elena. It's important." He listened to her soft footsteps as she crossed the room, and soon he saw the knob turn and the door open slightly. "May I come in?" he asked timidly. Without a word, she opened the door the rest of the way and allowed him entrance into a room he had not been in for almost 6 months. She walked over towards the window that overlooked the front of the home. He stepped next to her and peered outside. Villagers were beginning to gather on the lawn. "I'm afraid things have gone sideways, my love." "Don't call me that," she returned. He turned to her. "This is not the time for arguments. News has come from Petrograd. The provisional government has been eradicated and the Bolsheviks have taken over." Without looking at him, she asked, "What does that mean?" "It means that our way of life is over. The Bolsheviks do not believe in the sanctity of God-given rights like titles and land," he explained. "Why are the villagers here?" she asked quietly. "That I do not know." She turned to him now, tears in her eyes. "So it was all for nothing. You sent our son off to die for nothing." "We do not know that he is dead, Elena," he replied curtly. This did not faze her. "You sent other men off to die, and for what? Land? Land that your father lost? You could not be happy with what you had. You wanted more." "My father always wanted this valley back. I did only what I thought he would have done." A crash came from downstairs. They looked back out the window to see villagers streaming into the home. They must have broken the door. He took her hand and led her to the bed. There they sat to await their fate. They had been held in the old ancestral office for over a week, being fed minor rations of bread and some water. The room in which Ivan had given the information to Loganov had been emptied of all governmental items and replaced with 2 small cots. Locks had been placed on the doors and bars on the one window that had adorned the south wall. Ivan sat on his cot looking at Elena. She had grown weak lately and looked ill. She weakly turned her head to him. "Ivan," she said weakly, "we've been here for too long. What's going to happen to us?" He had no answer for this. He could only give her a little smile. "Nothing bad, my love." He stood from the cot and approached her. She took his hand. "They will hold us here for a while, then let us go once the new government is finalized." He paused. "I'm sure of it." They turned their heads towards the door as they heard a key hit the lock. It was not a normal time for rations. The knob started to turn, and the door slowly opened. The figure at the door stood tall and in uniform, with a red armband that had come to represent the Bolsheviks wrapped around his arm. His hair was long and unkempt. His beard flowed towards his chest, his face dirty, but the eyes were familiar. It was Elena who spoke first. "Alexei? Is that you?" Was this Alexei? Had his son come home? Ivan could not tell. The man spoke. "It is me, Mother. I've come to retrieve you." Ivan looked at Elena, a smile across his face. "See, honey? Nothing bad. They're going to let us go. That means things have calmed down." Alexei crossed the room without a word, without even looking at his father. He bent over Elena's cot, and with little effort, he picked her up to carry her. Ivan stood to follow, and this prompted Alexei to stop and turn towards him. "Not you, father. You must stay here. Tomorrow you face the tribunal. Lenin has sent a man named Joseph Stalin to hear your case. He will decide your fate." Ivan watched his son cross the threshold and out the door, his beautiful Elena in his arms. Alexei turned again. "Loganov told us everything, Father. It's unfortunate. If you had just been satisfied with what we had and not so focused on what Grandfather had lost, I'm sure the valley would be much more lenient." And with that, he walked away, and the door closed behind him. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand?
Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.